All right, everyone. Thanks so much. Welcome back to part two of this module, all about putting together your strategic, diverse, well composed governance council or governance board. Thanks so much for coming back to part two of this video session, which is going to be covering now the specific steps that you and your team can take once you're ready and prepared to start going out and doing better recruiting. And this could mean that you're a brand new organization looking to put together your founding governing board, or you might be a little bit more of an experienced organization, in which case this will certainly help you improve or rethink the current strategies, you use for recruiting. So let's go ahead and dive in. Step one of your best practices for recruiting, these 6 steps, really this first step draws back to a lot of the stuff that we've already covered in this module. The first step in being strategic about putting together your board is understanding who it is that you've currently got. And so if you haven't already, I really strongly encourage you to go back to the first video in this module and take a look at that, because we really go into the nuances of unpacking this puzzle of really what an ideal charter school board looks like. So the way you do this is you want to take an inventory or get an inventory of who exactly your board is made up of. So you want to get an inventory of your skills and the demographic makeup of your board members. Like we talked about before, there are tools out there to support you doing that. The key here is you want to take those skills and demographics and you want to track them and review them alongside the board members' individual term information. Why is this so important? Because as we talk about recruiting, one of the most important things that a board needs to consider as it does its recruiting is the succession planning of the board. So if you're a founding board, of course you're putting together the board that you need to kick things off. But then going forward, you're going to have to maintain as board members roll off, or they resign, or their terms expire, you're going to have to constantly replace those new individuals. So we need to know, for example, when our attorney on the board is going to be rolling off, and when the person on our board with real school finance expertise is going to be rolling off the board. That way, when we develop our recruitment priorities, you know exactly who it is that we're going to try and recruit for, which is the next step. We've got an idea of what it is that we need then 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the line. Another consideration is whether or not this organization or how this organization, your organization, is governing for growth. I mean a lot of different things here by governing for growth. One example would be whether you are, like I said, maybe still expanding as an organization. So perhaps you are adding a grade level at a time, or maybe you're an organization that's looking to go out and expand and replicate into new areas. Or, which we often see, perhaps you're a board that's looking to grow, maybe from your 7-member founding board to something more like 9 or 11 members on the board. These are all important things to consider as we get to the next step, which is approving the recruitment priorities for the year ahead. So remember, a lot of the board on track methodology that we talk about in a lot of our modules is that boards should think of their work through this cycle of assessing, aligning, and accelerating. Assessing, using data to assess their current makeup and needs. Now what we're going to be doing is aligning as a board on what it is that we should be recruiting for to complement those needs. And then the accelerating is going to come in these next steps where we talk about exactly how we go out and find people. So when you talk about approving recruitment priorities, really this should be a conversation that the full board has, where they say, based on this conversation about either who we currently have, or as it shows down here, if I'm a founding board, what kinds of things we need to accomplish in the year ahead, that's how we're going to determine who exactly it is that we're recruiting for. I like this line here in bold, that your form should follow function. What this means is that as you're composing your board, meaning forming your board either originally or sustainably through the years, you should be creating that form. You should be filling those seats specifically for the function that you've already agreed upon that the board needs to accomplish. So going back to an example that we frequently use, perhaps as a first-time organized organization and board, one of the first things that you are going to need to do is maybe go out and find a facility, a school, physical school building. Well, one of the top priorities that you should have as you're getting that founding board together then is finding somebody who's comfortable with commercial real estate transactions, perhaps a school architect, somebody who is really comfortable with helping shepherd the organization through acquiring a physical location. And if that's the case, then once you've acquired that building, maybe it's 5 years, 10 years down the line, maybe it is no longer part of the mission of the organization or one of the priorities of the organization to find a building. At this point, we may want to take that school architect and thank them for their service and maybe now replace that with somebody who maybe what we're trying to do right now is to really move the needle on closing the achievement gap. So maybe at this point, we want to add and beef up our academic sort of skills and professionalism on the board. So what you want to do, the way you do that is have a conversation based on who we have today and who's rolling off the terms and what it is that we need to accomplish in the next 3 to 5 years. What skills and expertise do we need in order to make that successful? Once you do that, the board should take a vote to charge your governance committee, your nominating committee, whoever it is on your team that's going to carry the water, so to speak, when it comes to recruitment, give them a specific charge for them that they can go out and recruit along these goals. Now that you've got the specific types of people that we're looking for, the next step is to actually go out and, referring back largely to the first part of the module, make sure that we're structured and set up for success. So the first thing we always like to talk about is how important it is to have a group of people who are identified to be the quarterbacks of this work. Oftentimes it's the governance committee. They typically manage the board's recruitment efforts. You may call it something differently. It may be called a nominating committee. Something that you might want to think about though is if you do not have a governance committee, you think about, have a conversation with your board about whether it's time to implement one. And if the answer is that you're not there as a board yet to implement a full governance committee, then the advice that I would give you is to make sure you identify someone on your board who can act as the quote-unquote governance champion. And what I mean by that is making sure that somebody on your board is primarily tasked with keeping a laser focus on good governance practices for the board. You're going to have a finance committee or finance group doing that work and academic oversight. So it's easy to lose sight of good governance practices. And especially when it comes to being proactive and strategic with recruiting, identify at least one person who can say, I will make my focus, refocusing our efforts on things like recruiting. The next step is to have a written and approved job description. This is so important for a couple of reasons. One is it will help you in your efforts of actually finding potential candidates. So when we talk about the step 2, when we talk about the recruitment priorities, we mean describing the actual skill sets and descriptors that we can most detailed describe who it is that we're looking for. So for example, if we are looking for somebody, maybe we've got a board made up of only millennials, and so we want someone who's got a little bit more life experience on the board and who also is an accountant, ideally with school finance experience. I want to then take our template job description about our organization and make sure that I add that we are ideally recruiting somebody with accounting, school finance, that kind of experience in there. That way, we can be strategic with how we use that job description. So we can go to the places that we know we're going to best find accountants or people with finance experience. Another thing here is to make sure you've got some tools to help you objectively analyze your board members to compare them equally apples to apples. In an ideal world, as you start implementing some of these practices, we want you to get to a point where you're no longer just begging board members to join your board, but that you may actually have a couple more people interested to serve than you have seats available. And so if you get to that point where you've got maybe 3 people looking to serve on your board and you've only got 1 or 2 seats, it's a really great idea to make sure you've got these screening questions and evaluation tools so that you're able to ask the same interview questions to each candidate. And that way that you're getting answers to the same question so you can compare and contrast their different answers. Similarly, having an evaluation tool like an objective rubric or scoring tool will help it so that as you go from candidate to candidate, you don't lose sight of the things that you really liked in an earlier candidate, or maybe some of the things that you thought were challenges. Having these kinds of tools will again help make sure that the board is being laser focused on the strategic things, so you don't get wowed or end up selecting a board member for the wrong reasons. Remember, we're going to set some goals, some priorities, and we want to stick to those or adjust them as necessary. I'm realizing I said there were a couple reasons for having a written job description, so I just want to go back to the other one. The first one is helping you go out and find the kinds of people you want. But then the other real reason for having a written job description ties down to this next era, which is about having a board member agreement. And the benefit here is with managing expectations. What you do not ever want to do is have a situation where you're pouring in effort into your strategic recruiting, and then you bring on a candidate, and then for one reason or another, that candidate doesn't end up being successful. Maybe they aren't able to make the time commitment, or they didn't realize that they were going to have to serve on a committee as well as of full board meetings, or maybe they weren't aware that they'd have to help out with fundraising for whatever reason. That's all burnt and wasted time. So one of the things we encourage people to do is, as you find your candidate, have a board member agreement in place, something that you can share with your candidate before they finally join your board. And of course, it's not a legally binding contract, but it outlines the set of expectations that will be expected of the individual if they join the board. And it's nice to have the board chair and the candidate, the trustee, sign the form as something so that when a year or two you can look back on it and perhaps there's become a chronic attendance problem. Now you have something where you can point to that you can maybe politely, respectfully, and professionally ask that person to step down and move on to some other work. And then lastly are the orientation materials, and we'll get to these later on in the session, but making sure that when you've got your board members finally ready to join, you've got the tools in place to get them up and running with your board work as soon as possible. All right, so step 4 is can be one of the most difficult parts, which is actually going out and identifying the potential candidates. So this is the recruiting part. This is the finding actual people who are willing and able to serve on the team. So how is it that you go out and you find candidates, right? This can be a challenging part. Having the written job description will definitely aid in this work. Like I said, it can be very helpful in doing things such as cold calling. So an example that I got into a little bit earlier would be if you need somebody with finance experience, accounting experience, school finance experience. One of the best things you can do is, rather than waiting for a parent or somebody to come to you who happens to fit one of those needs, or dipping into your Rolodex or your own network, is to reach out to places like the local accounting firm in your area, or reaching out to the big business in your area and reaching out to their business department or accounting department. It's something that we're seeing more and more around the country now, are especially younger people and millennials wanting to get involved and give back with some sort of community service. So it's not unheard of to find people who are really great board members, willing to put in the time commitment, aligned with your mission, who are just a little bit further outside of your individual network. The next part here is considering, I'm going to talk about it on this next slide, but it's the notion of referral sources. And the key here that I want the takeaway to be is that not every potential candidate that you will come across needs to be a candidate, right? Some of those people will not necessarily be the best person for your board, but they'll be really great referral sources. So rather than thinking of every person as a candidate, think of whether these people could potentially be a really strong referral source. So an example of this would be people who are just too close to the organization or to the other board members to be effective. So if you're looking for that accountant, you might have a brother-in-law who's an accountant. Well, guess what? That brother-in-law might not be the right fit for the board because they're too close to you. They might not have the time commitment. But that brother-in-law is a great source to say, hey, do you have anybody in your network who might be, part of your accounting network who would be a strong candidate that would be interested. That's the kind of creativity that gets you beyond, the immediate network that you have. Looking to current and past board members, as well as your current donor base, is another great way of finding referral sources. So if you've got a candidate profiled, you've got that recruitment priority put together, you've got a written job description, it's a great thing to go and do an email blast to your network and say, attention community, we're looking for someone to serve on our board, ideally, that fits this kind of profile. We'd love to hear would love for you to share it with your broader network. The next two kind of go, actually, let's just take this one. Local leaders, same thing. People who are great and connected in your community are great referral sources often. Something that people don't always think about, but is one of the best candidates for board service are local college and university presidents, or just leadership of those local colleges and universities. This is a great way to help expand the sort of pipeline and to support your students as they continue their educational career beyond your immediate school, helping to set them up for career and work, whatever the next step is. Actually, you go ahead and actually take off the college and university part. Depending on where you are as an organization, it's great to have other educational leaders as part of your team. So if you're a charter high school, it's great to have a local charter elementary or middle school leader on your board as well. Again, it helps to bridge sort of that gap, make sure that people are, the full child's educational career is being addressed. So now that you've got a pool of candidates, hopefully you've got, one or two people applying for each seat so that you can be somewhat selective in who it is that you're choosing. Now is the time to screen these candidates to make sure that they're the right fit for your board. So going back to the point in the getting your right tools together about having questions ahead of time, having agreed upon questions for whoever is going to be involved in interviewing or screening these candidates is a great way to make sure that you're comparing answers apples to apple. Another thing here, tip here that I've got is make sure that these individuals are asked, or as a minimum requirement, expected to visit the school and actually attend one of your board or committee meetings in person. This is really important as a very minimum threshold of screening out candidates. It's great to have them meeting in person with their potential future colleagues, so your current colleagues on the board. This is a big part of this, as we talked about in the earlier part of this module, are the sort of soft skill fits. How do these individuals fit as part of your team? Beyond whether they bring accounting experience, do they fit in? Do they have the kind of cultural fit with your board? And then also, as a minimum threshold, do these individuals not have the time to actually show up for a meeting? You'd be shocked to see how many people, say that they're ready and willing and able to join a board, but then have chronic attendance problems. And so if this individual can't attend a meeting before they're actually a full voting board member, that should be a red flag for whether they'll be able to attend the meetings as full voting board members. The next thing here, like we've talked about, is use an objective ranking scoring tool, again, so that you can be objective and focused on those strategic elements that we're focused on. Another thing here is you're going to want to be sure to screen for that cultural fit, like I said, but think of that not just for the board, as I mentioned it earlier on this slide, but broader mission alignment, cultural fit with the organization, the sort of entrepreneurial spirit or focus of your organization. Now that we've done that, now that we've gone through our potential candidates, and actually I think it's worthy to pause here for just a moment and talk about screening candidates if you do not have one or two extra people for every seat. Let's say you are going out and really having a difficult time getting membership. There are some strategies that you can employ, and if they don't bear out, and you're just in a position where you have the kind of candidates that you have, applying these same kind of processes, maybe with a little bit less rigor, is again still a great way to set the expectations for how this is a part-time professional board that you're working on. All right, so now that we've gone through this and we've got our candidates, we've screened them, the next step is to select who we want and get them up and running on our board as soon as possible. So these really come back to some of the key governance committee tasks. If you have a governance committee or a nominating committee, these are things that we would really expect from them. And if not, then having that governance champion, again, this will be something key for them to focus on. Got an asterisk here to ask yourself whether or not you and your team have an approved nomination policy or process. If you do not, go ahead and open up and read the attached PDF in the module, the sample nomination policy, and adapt it to your needs and bring it back to your board. It's really important that either in your bylaws or as a nomination policy that you have developed a process that's easy to understand, right? It does not need to be in dense legalese, but outlines the process by which your board selects new board members to be on the board or elects new board members. And then you're going to want to go ahead and follow that. So it's likely that somebody from your team needs to nominate an individual at a meeting, and then the board will vote to approve them. What's so important is that immediately, or if not prior to and sort of concurrent with that approval nomination process, needs to be the onboarding or the orientation for this person. You want to start that right away because, again, you got limited board members, and those board members have a limited time on the board. So it's really important that we get people ramped up and that we sort of quash that learning curve as best as we can so people are full participants in your work as soon as possible. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that as you end this presentation that you go ahead and ask your board whether you have an approved orientation process. And if you don't, go ahead and read our sample orientation manual and go ahead and make sure that you've got the right steps and the right tools in place to help these new board members be successful. The first thing you're going to want to have are some materials. We like to call it the orientation packet. It's any sort of written documentation that you can give to the individual to help them get prepared for board service. This often includes things like your strategic planning documents, the charter itself. What is our mission? What is our vision? What are the previous minutes, the previous year's minutes and agendas, so I can go through and read what it is that we were working on and talking about last year. It's a great idea to add quick bios of your fellow board members. You know, it's a subtle little thing, but some of you who've served on a board before may have had this experience where you've been on a board with somebody for maybe a year, but you've never really gotten to know them well, and now it's kind of uncomfortable that you didn't know what their background was. So little things like that give somebody a leg up to get comfortable with your board work. It's a great idea to do an annual training session. We recommend at an annual board retreat or sometime over the summer or in the winter that you have a formal training session, not just exclusively for new board members, but for everybody on your team. It's a great idea to bring in a consultant or an attorney to give an update on conflict of interest laws, open meeting laws, your fiduciary duties as a board member, but then also to facilitate a conversation about good board governance. Great idea to have a mentorship program or board buddy type program. It can be as simple as something where you have identified, you match up a new board member with a veteran board member so that they can arrive at the meeting 15 or 20 minutes early and cruise through the agenda real quick and make sure if there's any questions. A lot of times it's as simple as terminology that that someone wasn't aware of, things like that. Once you go through your approved orientation process, the goal should be to have these board members who have a specific skill set or expertise or background that they're coming to contribute some real good work and professionalism to your board. You've gone through and oriented them, and so they're up to speed as soon as possible. So they got a full term there to be a contributing board member. Best of luck as you go out and do this recruiting. I'm just going to give a quick summary of all of these steps, so you have them all on one page. Step 1: take stock of your current membership. Who is it that we've got today? What are their skill sets? What are their backgrounds? How long are they going to be on this board with us? Then we're going to align on those recruitment priorities. Who is it that we need to recruit to complement this board and to meet the needs of our organization as it evolves? Next, we're going to make sure that before we go out and start a recruitment that we've got the kinds of tools in place that we need to be successful in that effort. Once we're done that, we're going to use that job description, all this information to go out and identify the potential candidates to join our team. Once we've got hopefully, potentially more candidates than we have open seats, which is always the dream, we're going to go ahead and screen those potential candidates and compare apples to apples so that we can make sure it's the right fit for the board and for the organization. And then once we do that, we're going to nominate and we're going to onboard them to our team. So if you have any more questions about the next steps that you have, please feel free to refer back to this presentation or to the module itself. Next steps here are to make sure that you've got the written job description sample, the nominating policy, and that orientation manual so that you can be successful as you get up and running with your recruitment efforts. Good luck.